Hi, I'm Brittney Gallagher in the middle of a sunrise forest, joined by.
I'm Phil Libin. It's great to be in this sunrise forest with you.
Yeah, it's very relaxing and tranquil. Um, and welcome to episode 4 of Degrees of Freedom Making the Out of Office World. Last time we talked about that great return to office debate and heard from leaders and knowledge workers on their thoughts of returning to the office. And in this episode, we're talking about trust and how trust has changed in this out of office world. And to me, it feels like there's a bit of two competing ideologies happening where there's this, I need you in the office because if I see you there, then I trust that you're working because you're there. Versus the distributed way of doing things is like, I trust that you're doing your job and I know that you're not if things aren't done when we agree upon the time they're being done. And I feel like there's a lot of people on that former side that really still want to see you physically there.
A lot of this comes down to kind of the fundamentals of how companies and employees think about each other and interact, and what people can and should be trusted to do, and whether you have to earn trust or you should just have trust by default. These are all like really big issues that being distributed teams force you to grapple with.
In this episode, as we said, we're exploring trust. And up first is Asana's Joanna Miller to talk to us about what it actually means to trust and how, as Phil already said, we should probably trust by default.
And then we've got Lydia Jett from the SoftBank Vision Fund back talking about building trust over video. And Tammy Sun from Fertility, who's talking about how to hire people without ever having met them in person.
And later in the episode, I interview two knowledge workers. Or Phil, I hear you're newly calling it people who work from laptops. Is that your new
Yeah,
phrase?
I think we stole that from someone. I think someone on the team heard a smarter person say that. I've been saying knowledge workers for decades, and then I think we heard someone better say people who work on laptops, and we're like, yes, that does
That is
explain it
true.
almost perfectly in a
Yeah.
friendlier way. So it's people who work on laptops.
All right. So anyway, some people who work on laptops who actually happen to both work for talking about how, what it was like for them having worked together online for a long time and then what it was like once they met in person.
But first, here's Joanna, Lydia, and Tammy on trust. How do you go about building trust on the team, especially in a distributed world? And what does trust mean? Like, what are you actually hoping that people experience as part of that?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question around what does trust mean? Because when I think about that, my mind automatically goes to the term integrity. So how often do I do what I say that I'm going to do by when, or how comfortable do I feel to renegotiate that with people that I'm in relationship with, whether in the workplace or whatnot. And I think before we changed the way that we worked physically, trust was a big conversation at Asana in terms of how we distributed work. So instead of having, there's a manager and they're dictating who's working on what, so who has the expertise around the subject that we're working on, that person should probably be the decision maker, and they should be empowered to pull together the team, the stakeholders that are best suited to work on this objective. That philosophy or that thinking around trust has extended into how we think about how we work together when we're distributed now. So some ways in which that's come up is, one, how do we be clear about what's expected of people? Like, what's the bare minimum? Like, this is your work. This is the deliverables or the KRs that we expect you to achieve. Here are the people we'd love for you to bring into this work and be aware of it. How you get it done is really up to your discretion on what would best serve the team and the objective. And I think we've seen more interesting ways to collaborate asynchronously because of that. And it's really teaching people to amplify trust through how they communicate, making sure that the touch points that they have with team members are intentional, and being clear and honest when we're reflecting back on our work, what worked and what didn't work, and how can we make changes for whatever's coming up ahead.
There seems like the concepts of trust are maybe changing, and maybe changing rapidly in this out of office distributed world. How do you see trust working in SoftBank, in the companies that you invest in your own life, and has it changed?
Listen, I think trust is easier to grant in long periods of positive upward rising markets, and we have been in
Good
one.
point.
And so,
Yeah.
in a period where everyone looks smart and everything's growing and everything is positive, it's easier to grant trust. But I still think it's hard to grant trust. And I think one of the beautiful things, there have been so many beautiful outcomes of this horrible pandemic, but one of the beautiful outcomes is I think it has taken away the waste. I'll call it the waste in the system of a lack of trust. Because as I think about the 20 years that I have worked, there's always been a culture of FaceTime. It has always been about showing that you're working harder by sitting in the office later, always being tethered to your desk. I am talking about a day pre-cell phone, so you have to be tethered to your desk to answer anyone calling you. I just felt like my entire career was defined by that visual of sitting at your desk and working harder. And the last couple years have been a period of time where we have proven, at least our organization, at least I think a lot of organizations like ours, we've proven how effective we can be where we just assume trust. And think about the enormous gain of efficiency we're all getting back as an economy. What a terrible way to waste effort and time is in not trusting each other. So my hope is that this remains, because I haven't seen a reason not to grant it. And I'm such an optimist about this forward world in terms of the benefits this brings to all of us.
Okay, so how did you hire 180 people? Like, with just specifically, like, I think people want to know, like, because everything I heard at the beginning of the pandemic, right, was like, oh, but hiring is going to be almost impossible. How could you hire someone without ever having met them? And I'm like, I don't know. Yeah, but it seems like it's going to be hard.
I think like we have really invested a lot in considering different talent pools that we otherwise, as I said before, like embarrassingly would never have considered, right? So it unlocks platforms, solutions that we would have been like, oh yeah, no, that's like a Mideast regional, hiring platform or a recruiter. Like, why would we be interested in anyone in Ohio? Like, we're super interested in anyone in Ohio who's high performing. If you're in Ohio and you're brilliant, like, come talk to me. And so
Talk to me first.
So I think it's just a matter of, like, being intentionally knowing, having your recruiting team, your hiring managers, your leadership team, knowing that they are geographically unconstrained. And that was like another area of predictability that we tried to inject into the company very early on in the pandemic, which was, we're currently licensed to operate in 15 countries. Like, should we focus our hiring there? Should we only be hiring in the 15 countries? Because then we don't have to do all the paperwork that is involved in, like, hiring and doing payroll. And it was like, no, we will absorb 100% of the cost, because we are going to assume that at some point we will hire in every state. So we will just, let's absorb that cost now. Let's just plow through the licensing and the paperwork that's involved. We'll do it. It's a one-time thing. It's not going to repeat. And then we tell everybody to find the best people no matter where they are.
I was always brought up with this idea that people need to earn your trust, or you need to earn someone's trust. And now I kind of think, well, no, I'm going to trust you by default. Like, I don't have time for you to earn my trust. I need to trust you from day one. And you can break the trust. And then, that's a big problem, and maybe we can get it back and maybe we can't. But I almost have to just have to shift the default position to be from, well, I don't trust you and you're gonna have to earn it, to, yeah, I trust you from day one. We have to move forward on that presumption. Otherwise, it's just too inefficient and we can't work together.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Like, how do you establish trust? Is it a default thing that everyone's entitled to? Do you have to earn it, and so on?
I feel very strongly, similar to what you described, that it's a default. By hiring you, by welcoming you onto the team, I have a pretty good, high level of expectation that, like, you can do the work, that you're a good fit for this community. We also want to learn from you. I think the other thing that I think happens inevitably in a workplace, especially, or anytime you're collaborating on something, folks are going to make mistakes. They're going to be failures. Despite our best intentions, I may not get back to someone by the time that I told them I was going to do that. And so I think a really important aspect of stress that people sometimes overlook is, how are we going to communicate about what's happening when it goes wrong? What
Right.
does renegotiating our agreements look like? Like, what are the components of a good agreement? So both of us have information symmetry, understanding of what we think might happen, and what are the next steps we're going to take if we go off path. So I spend a lot of time talking with employees and also my coaching clients about how do you tell people like what your baseline desire is for the outcome of a project.
Right.
So like, hey, like I don't expect you to stay up until 2 a.m. If those are not your normal working hours, and cancel plans with your family just to get this deck done. I certainly don't expect that of my team members. So if you're going late into the night, I just want you to tell me like, hey, I can't get this done. Is there any extra time or another person who maybe could do it? Someone saying that versus not communicating at all is something that raises trust for me.
Yeah, and I guess the flip side of that as the manager is, you should try to be clear about when you actually need to have something by, when you need to have something by, and then if at all possible, let people know, as early as possible. So say, hey, I'm gonna need this in 2 weeks. So, and I trust you to manage your time. So no, I really do need it in 2 weeks. It's a big problem if I don't have it in 2 weeks,
Yeah.
but giving you way enough notice for you to figure out how to get it done.
Would you invest in a founder in a company that you've hadn't met in person before the investment?
So my relationship with you is unique in that you might be the only person I'd met that I invested in last year. My team that I work with, we invested in 15 companies, and I think we maybe met one of those companies in person in 2021. And so, my job's a little different. As a late stage investor, what you're really spending time looking at to some degree is company performance. There's a company standing. They have customers, they have contracts, they have KPIs. And so there is more to evaluate. But personally, do I believe trust can be built? What's the fundamental question you're asking is, can trust be built in a virtual way? And absolutely. And I think that
Well,
is
at least can it start in a virtual way? I'm not saying you never meet people. I'm just saying you don't have to do it as a precondition. I find this like usually it's like older, white guys that say this like, oh, I gotta look into your eyes and shake your hand before I can really like trust you. And I'm like, that is just creepy.
if I can hire half of my team, I have never met. They've been working for me for a year and we've never met in person. The team members that I have met, I've met maybe 3 times in our entire working career together. And so I'm obviously a believer that I can bestow trust on people until broken. But trust is really the concentric circle it all works around. And what I've realized over the years is I'm happy to go make an investment where we haven't necessarily guaranteed trust. But if trust is broken, that might be the end of that relationship. And where trust grows through hard times, through bad, difficult stuff, because every company has bad, difficult stuff, where trust grows, we'll be together forever. And so, does any of that need to be in person? No. Would it be nice to be? Yeah, it would, but I don't see it as a precondition for me.
That was Phil interviewing Joanna, Tammy, and Lydia, talking about what it's like to build trust in a distributed world and what it means to trust. And how do you hire people you've never met in person before? Now that we've heard from leadership, let's hear from the knowledge workers who are shaping this out-of-office world, or as Phil's now calling them, the people who work from laptops. Up next, I'm joined by Arvind Shahal and Steven Cezanne, who worked together for months virtually before meeting in person. And we talk a bit about what that was like. In this episode, we're talking about how trust by default in this distributed world. And from what I understand, you both have worked together for some time virtually, and just only recently met in person. Arvind, could you talk a little bit about what that was like virtual first and then meeting in person?
Yeah. So, like everyone else, I've been working remote for the last couple of years, and I think meeting up with Steven about a week and a half ago. I think he was like maybe the first or second person I've met up with in person, like colleague, like literally in the last 2 years. And so that was nice. And like I don't think being fully remote and being fully distributed means that you are totally closed off from in person. In fact, I'd say it amplifies the importance of in-person occasionally. When a company is going fully remote, you're making a choice that your day-to-day is kind of wherever the individual wants to be, and then occasionally you need to come together for some high impact work. Uh, what I think really gets missed being fully remote is those off the cuff chance encounters where you get to know people, and because that's the stuff that helps to build a foundation of a relationship, and you really like need that to start building trust with each other, and in order to collaborate and co-create together. And so I love the fact that at our company, we're really encouraged to meet up with our people, with our colleagues, in person.
I couldn't agree more with what Arvind just said there. And I think it's amazing that Arvind and I have been working together on the same team now for a few months. And I felt like I knew him pretty well, and I feel like he knew me pretty well as well. But when we had the opportunity to meet in person for the first time, it was amazing. Like, we gave each other a massive hug. We just drank our coffees, and we didn't talk about work. We talked about life, and we got to know each other on a whole different level that we haven't been able to do over the past few months, working in a distributed way. I think it really made that in-person time together, that live synchronous time, very special and very much needed, because now whenever Arvind and I hop onto a call one-on-one, or if we're talking to a customer or whatever the occasion may be, I'll remember things about our conversation that make me view Arvind as more as a person versus a colleague on my team. And I thought that it built a really special connection and a lot of trust that went both ways, and that'll lead towards a more productive relationship as we look to scale our company and grow the business.
If either of you don't mind, I'm just curious, what was something interesting that you learned about the other person when you met in person that you didn't know before?
I don't know why, but maybe I just like made it up in my head. For some reason, I thought Steven like was a big baseball fan. But when we were talking, he's like, no, for me it's golf and it's hockey. I'm like that should make sense because he's got a Tiger Woods hat and he wears that half the time. And
Oh,
so
it's Tiger Woods hat.
yeah. So like, but so it was a pleasant surprise to learn that he loves hockey and he loves golf. And again, I feel like, hey, if we'd been in the office, like I probably would have picked up on that in some way or another. We had to have the in-person meeting where we were intentional about just getting to know each other and talking casually to make that happen.
Steven, what about you?
Ooh, I think first impression is that I turned around. I got to the coffee shop first before Arvind, and then I turned around and I see Arvind, two people behind me. And I thought I was going to be looking like on an equal plane, but I slowly drifted my head up this tall figure.
Yeah.
So needless to say, I think Arvind was taller than I had expected him to be. You like can't gauge that over video.
At all.
And exactly. And to Arvind's point, like you would pick up on that obviously if you work in person together, but it's just, that's always interesting to me, but also just talking with Arvind more, learning about how much of a coffee aficionado he is, with, again, like just in a casual conversation where we're working but remotely, I probably wouldn't have gravitated towards that tidbit, or I wouldn't have known that about him. But when you're intentional about your time and getting to know more about the person on a very intimate, personal level, you start talking about things that you wouldn't otherwise talk about while you're working behind a video camera, or on a keyboard. So I really enjoyed that time, and I'll cherish that for a long time.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining me to talk about this. And it was nice to meet you both. And hope maybe I'll meet you in person someday.
Hopefully.
Yes.
Love that.
And you'll see how
Thanks,
short
Brittney.
I am. That was Arvind and Steven, both who work from who work together a lot virtually before actually meeting in person, and talking a little bit about what that's like. Phil, one thing that Lydia mentioned that I think is really interesting was that trust is a lot easier in an upward rising market. But now we're kind of seeing the economy pull back from that. Phil, how do you feel about that? Do you think, trust is changing?
Yeah, I think everything feels easier when there's lots of money sloshing around. But actually, this is my fourth time running a company through a downturn, through a recession, and I got to say, a lot of stuff is actually makes more sense when times are tough, because there's a lot less distortion, there's a lot less nonsense. Rewards are correlated more closely with accomplishment. And so things are just a bit more rational, and I actually find it generally easier to deal with people when times are bad. Easier to get on the same page, easier to know what what the most important survival skills are, how to take advantage of opportunities. I think in general, when there's a lot of cash in the system, people operate in greed mode, and it may feel good, but it's actually hard to trust people in greed mode. So yeah, I think this change is actually probably just makes things even more real and makes a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about make even more sense for me than it did before.
Sequoia had a big announcement too recently, and it seems like we're actually entering another crucible moment, as they've so coined. How do you feel about that? Do you feel like is in another crucible moment?
We're lucky. All of our stuff is in pretty good shape, just because we figured that things would go up and down, and so when things were up, we were able to get a lot of runway, make sure that we have enough to go heads down and focus on building the product and building value, and not really worry about running out of cash in the bank. So we're lucky. A lot of startups aren't. We're doing what we can to help some of the startups that we're working with and are affiliated with. But like I said, this is a normal cyclical progression, and it's important. A lot of really great companies are built during times of great difficulty, and this is going to be no exception. So I think this is a very big opportunity to build cool stuff that matters, and have just a little bit less bullshit than we normally have when times are great.
Yeah, there'll be less juiceros, right? So that was the first one that came to my mind.
Yeah, the juicero. Yeah,
that was I don't know why that was the thing that, like, when you said that, I was like, juicero.
yeah. We've had a few crypto and other things happen, between now and then. But yeah.
I went back to the one that I saw a billboard for, and then a week later, it no longer existed, and I was like,
wow. Well, and it also I think this, like, companies that were kind of on the fence about, well, maybe we should keep an office around, for 2 days a week as an option for people, but of course that costs the same as having an office for 7 days a week, and those decisions are easier to kind of punt when you don't worry about money. But when you start figuring out what to cut, you start worrying about money, it becomes much more real. And so I actually expect a lot of businesses that had been toying with the idea of maybe hybrid, maybe bringing people back to work sometime, whatever, will finally realize that stuff's just stupid, because it leaves you with all the costs and almost none of the benefits. So I think we'll see an acceleration of a bunch of the trends that we've been talking about on this series.
That's it for this episode of Degrees of Freedom, Making the Out of Office World.
Thanks to our guests, Joanna, Lydia, Tammy, Stephen, and Arwen.
And until next time, I'm Brittney Gallagher.
I'm Phil Libin. Bye.